Today's insider is Dani Dayan, the former Consul General of Israel to New York, and I am so excited to have you on today. How's being back in Israel after 4 years in the Big Apple?
It's always good to be back in Israel, even though I had, as you said, to quarantine for 14 days, but now I'm a free person. I am free also of the burden of being a diplomat, so I can speak freely. It's a great advantage. But one of the things that bothered me most during my term in New York, that I had to represent and not only be myself.
So the first Israeli delegation to UAE is departing Monday, tomorrow. Are you surprised by the incredible pace in which this agreement is advancing?
Yes and no. I mean, it's when we compare it with other countries in the area that do have a covered relationship with Israel, and we see the courage of the UAE leaders in making this development public and then really accelerating the pace. In some sense, it is surprising. But you know, Michelle, we are in a completely different period that, especially for us, the older people, is difficult to grasp. We grew up knowing that, as a fact, as an axiom, that there is an Israeli-Arab conflict, that Israel has a conflict with the Arab states. There is no conflict anymore with the Arab states. Some of them we have a public relationship, diplomatic relationship, like in Egypt, Jordan, and now the UAE. But with many others, almost all of them, we have some sort of relationship, of friendly relationship, of productive relationship, of mutually fruitful relationship, and no real conflict. We have still an unresolved conflict with our immediate neighbors, the Palestinians, but not with the Arab world. You know, we have a peace agreement with Egypt for 40 years, more than 40 years. We have peace with Jordan for some 25 years. But there is a difference between this agreement, this peace agreement with the UAE and the two others that I mentioned, without underestimating their importance. They are immediate neighbors of Israel. We have borders with them, so that's clear that they are extremely important. But the UAE, we have peace with their people, and they educated their people for peace with Israel. A thing that unfortunately the Egyptians and the Jordanians didn't do. So we have very cordial relations with and cooperation, strategic cooperations with the governments of Egypt and Jordan, but unfortunately there is a lot of hostility in their population. Not so with the UAE. We see in the UAE really a kind of a heartwarming acceptance, and as like they were waiting for it to happen exactly as we did.
You're a known advocate for the Israeli settlement movement, and you're also a big supporter of the Israel-UAE agreement. Are you being criticized by people from within your own circle?
Well, unfortunately, there is some criticism among certain political circles in Israel, settlers, and not only them. I think this is a huge mistake to criticize the agreement. Look, I was a proponent, I was an advocate of the applying Israeli law, Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and also the Jordan Valley. But if you observe the situation, you should have understood that it's not going to happen right now. It will not happen without a coordination, a close coordination with the American administration. And at some stage, it became very clear that kind of coordination doesn't exist, that the administration is willing for Israel to wait. That's their expectation. And therefore, it was not on the table, the applying this sovereignty. Therefore, the fact that we traded the so-called annexation for the peace agreement with the UAE was a win-win situation. And beyond that, look, Michelle, this is this is, you know, Shimon Peres spoke so much about for decades about the new Middle East. Now this is the new Middle East coming to life in front of our eyes. We cannot miss this opportunity.
Does this agreement give you hope regarding peace with the Palestinians?
Well, unfortunately, on this front, I am pessimistic. I see the Palestinian reactions to this agreement, their rejection of this agreement, and that is very sad. The fact they should have been, I mean, if they are looking for peace with Israel, an atmosphere of peace should be conducive to a peace agreement with Israel and the Palestinians. So I'm not disappointed because I didn't expect them to act differently, but it's sad that they oppose this move. And they don't join the moderate axis, the peace-seeking axis in the Middle East. And I see their, I would say, recalcitrant positions, their rejectionist positions towards recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and their avoidance of coming to the negotiating table, their outright rejection of the peace, the Trump peace plan. Those are bad signs. Even today, I had a brief Twitter battle with one of the Palestinian leaders that is considered relatively moderate, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, when she retweeted a tweet in which the Israeli city of Kiryat Gat in southern Israel was labeled an illegal Jewish settlement. So as long as they continue to see all of Israel as an illegal Jewish settlement, I am unfortunately pessimistic about the prospects of peace with the Palestinians, but we will continue to strive for it.
Is this agreement Nobel Peace Prize worthy?
Probably, I think it is. I'm not naive, and I know that the considerations of the Academy of the Parliament, actually is in the Norwegian Parliament. They will never grant a Nobel Peace Prize to the three leaders that achieved this agreement, but because they are not part of their milieu, part of their those persons that they consider progressive enough to award them a peace Nobel Peace Prize. But yes, no doubt, this is a peace deal between two countries that were belligerent since they came to exist. You know, I don't want to be cynical, but yes, it's much more peacemaking than other recipients of the prize, including former American presidents.
What would you say to people who claim that the settlement movement and settlements are the biggest impediment to peace and a threat to Israel's future as a democracy?
That's simply not true. It's simply not true. The biggest, actually, I would say almost the only impediment to peace is the refusal of the Palestinians to see us, Israel, Jews, as indigenous to this land. Look, there is an asymmetry between us and them, between Israelis and Palestinians, between Zionists and Palestinians. Most of us came to accept the fact, and that includes Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it includes me, that to come to terms with the fact that history created two indigenous people to this patch of land the size of New Jersey that we call Eretz Israel and they call Palestine. The Jews are indigenous to this land and the Palestinians are indigenous to this land. And that's the reason that Israel, in every case in which a compromise was proposed, Israel accepted it. Even the Zionist movement before that Israel was founded. The Palestinians see themselves as the exclusive indigenous people of the area. They see us in Tel Aviv, in Kiryat Gat, as in Hebron, as colonialists. And as long as that is the situation, they will not compromise. The most they will do is to agree to a ceasefire. That's that's the reason, Michelle, that I always think that the most important person in the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians is not the President of the United States, is not the Secretary General of the UN, is not the Prime Minister of Israel, and not even the President of the Palestinian Authority. The most important person in our peace process is the Minister of Education of the Palestinian Authority. When they will start to educate their children and youngsters that we Jews also belong, not exclusively, but we also belong. We are rightfully here and not, a European colonialist invasion, then the peace process will start. And I will tell you something more. The moment we Israelis will feel that we are accepted, that it is genuine, you will be surprised how forthcoming Israelis will become in a negotiation. But as long as we feel the opposite, we see the opposite, not only feel the opposite, then we will be very adamant.
So you're bringing it back all to education again. You've said in previous interviews that you do not support a two-state solution, but you also don't support a one-state solution. What's the alternative?
Well, I think that we have here in this, as this conflict is so peculiar, we have to build a peculiar architecture that will allow us to resolve the conflict. You know, I saw the other day a webinar in which Peter Beinart, the new guru of the one-state solution, the new Jewish guru of the new one-state solution, was dialoguing with the Palestinian, and the Palestinian told him that in a one-state solution, Zionists cannot be a part of the one-state solution. So that means a Palestinian state, the one Palestinian state. I mean, we have to abandon Zionism. That's absurd. That's not even a compromise. And that's the reason. Look, I am mainly regarding the two-state solution. I also pessimistic on the possibility to achieve it, and if achieved, whether it solves the conflict, or we see in Judea and Samaria the same scenario that we saw in Gaza. So that's the problem. So we have to build, I don't know, we have first of all to wait until the Palestinians accept us and want to negotiate a genuine peace with us, and not just an armistice until we are weak enough to defeat us. And then we will have to build, you know, again, and I already mentioned once Shimon Peres. I'm surprising myself by mentioning for the second time Shimon Peres. He was an advocate of a functional compromise instead of a territorial compromise. Well, maybe we'll have to build on those ideas, but unfortunately, it's too premature to do that. The Palestinians are not there yet, you know, accepting us as legitimate in this area.
You think Zionism is often misunderstood?
Zionism is the most distorted, vilified word in the international political jargon. I think that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, the most justified national liberation movement in the whole history, in the human history, not just Jewish history. I also happen to believe that Theodor Herzl was the greatest Jew that existed in the last 2,000 years. It's amazing that what he accomplished in 44 years of life. But what is Zionism? Zionism is an umbrella term. Zionism is an umbrella term, although the comprises all those that believe that the Jews are entitled to a homeland in a part or all, but you can be a minimalist Zionist, a maximalist Zionist, a socialist Zionist, a free market Zionist, a religious Zionist, an atheist Zionist. Zionism is an umbrella term for all of us that believe that Jews are entitled to their homeland in Eretz Israel. And whoever negates that right, in my view, is a bigot. Is an anti-Semite, is a person that accepts that every single nationality is entitled to its national home, except the Jews.
And I think maybe one of the biggest tragedies is seeing a lot of the, I don't know if to say a lot, but some of the Jewish communities also move away from Zionism and maybe grow apart from Israel. How would you describe Israel-diaspora relations today?
I think that Israel-diaspora relations are very good. I think that, look, the other day when a synagogue was attacked in Kenosha, Wisconsin, I noticed an Israeli flag in front of that synagogue. I'm not saying that that's the reason it was attacked, but what I'm meaning is, look, in every synagogue, in every shul that I visited in North America, Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, there were two flags, the flag of the United States and the flag of the State of Israel. That is very telling. You need a strong bond in order to do that. That means it's not something miscellaneous to your life. You put the flag of Israel, that it means a lot to you. And I can bring innumerable examples of that. But, you know, I'm not worried about those that criticize the policies of Israel. I represented the government of Israel. I believe that most policies of Israel are justified, not all of them I agree with, but most of them. But I'm not worried. I think you can be pro-Israeli and criticize the Israeli government. That's perfectly well. The problem is, on one hand, those that are they display apathy towards Israel. They don't care about Israel. That's my problem. Or those that are hostile to the existence of the state of Israel. The Torah Carta on one side and Jewish Voice for Peace on the other side. Those are, in my view, take themselves outside the tent. Not only the Zionist tent. They take themselves off limits of the Jewish solidarity tent. So that's the reason that I expanded very much the boundaries of those that I dialogued with, but I excluded those that left the Jewish solidarity tent, the Torah Carta on one hand and JBP on the other.
A lot of the Israeli organizations are really concerned about the younger generations. Is this something that concerns you, losing the same support that their parents have?
Look, I am more concerned about their adherence or lack of adherence to Jewish identity than to support of Israel. My first priority is their adherence to Jewish identity. You know, the thing that worries most about American Jewry and diaspora Jewry in general is the crisis of Jewish education. I don't know if I am a good product of a faulty product, but I am a product of my family that was a staunchly Zionist to non-observant family. And the amazing Jewish educational network that existed in my native Argentina back when I was a child. And when I see the crisis of Jewish education and how costly it is and how limited it is in America and probably today also in Argentina and elsewhere, that worries me because one generation without proper Jewish education is bad. 2 generations without proper Jewish education is very bad. 3 generations without proper Jewish education is catastrophic. I remember a certain young, very Zionist Reform rabbi in my office that told me, look, I have 3 kids. I have a salary. How can I afford sending my 3 kids to Jewish education? Of course, I would like to, but it is impossible. That worries me a lot. And I wonder to what extent Israel can assist the world Jewry on that respect when we have our own needs and problems. But I am very worried about that, much more than any other thing.
I think a lot of criticism coming from reform movements and even conservative is not feeling accepted by Israel. Is that something you want to change?
Problem. I was very outspoken, criticizing my own country and my own government regarding, and my own society. Probably that's the first point regarding the lack of religious pluralism in Israel. I think that Israel should do better. Now, I did it even when I wasn't allowed to say. I said it even when I wasn't allowed to say it as an Israeli diplomat. Nevertheless, I said it. Now that I am a private citizen, even more, I intend to be active in that inside the Israeli society. We have to educate the Israeli society that reform conservative Judaism is legit, and they are dedicated Jews, and we have to welcome them in Israel in a very different way to that we used to these days.
So what's your biggest takeaway from 4 years spent here in the United States?
Oh, I have so many. I would say that if Americans would like to take my advice, I think that the thing that made America great, really an uncomparable country, is that for many decades, many decades, if not centuries, there were moderate liberals and moderate conservatives, I would say the explicit words, moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, that knew how to cooperate and work together and forge alliances and friendships that boosted the United States forward. America is losing that. I can't conceive today, for instance, a kind of an alliance like the alliance between Joe Lieberman and Senator McCain. And I see with concern how the extremes are taking almost complete control of the political discourse in the United States. And it worries me. It worries me because I love the US, and I wish all the best to this country. But I think that the worship of guns on one hand and the calls to dismantle, abolish police on the other. Just I took two examples. I could take others. Are developments that weaken the American society, and probably it can also rip it apart.
You did meet with a very diverse crowd. You engaged with some of your biggest critics. What would you say is the biggest misconception about you?
About me? Well, you know, I said from day one, when there were those that had reservations regarding my nomination by Prime Minister Netanyahu to serve in New York, and they said that there is one very well-known Jewish leader that called the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, and said, don't send this flamethrower to New York. Another leader told me that he decided even not to speak with me, not to meet with me. And I was never worried about that. I said to my wife and to everyone that was willing to listen that I'm not worried how I will be received in New York, in the United States. The only thing that worries me is how I will be bid farewell. And I was very warmly sent back home, and the only thing that disappointed me was by Zoom and not being able to hug all the the hundreds and thousands of friends I made during my 4 years in New York. I'm not sure I return a different person that I arrived, but definitely I return with a much stronger commitment to the bond between Israel and the American Jewry. It's now part of my identity.
You also mentioned in previous interviews that the issue of African American history is close to your heart. I remember you telling me about the civil rights trail you took in Alabama with your daughter. What would you say are the most important lessons for the Israeli and Jewish community, and how can we better understand the issue of race in America and perhaps the BLM movement today?
Well, you know, I must admit that in spite of the fact that I learned extensively the issue of African American history and the slavery and the civil rights movement and the Jim Crow legislation, etc. And I visited almost every single place in which Martin Luther King has ever been, the place in which he was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and the place in which he was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, and in between. And as you said, I spent quite a few days with my daughter making the civil rights trail in Alabama, Selma, and Montgomery, and Birmingham, and others. And it's really fascinating. And I visited every single African American history museum that existed in the areas in the cities I visited. I must admit that only in the last weeks and months after the murder of George Floyd, I understood how slavery and segregation are still an open wound in American society. I knew it racially. I mean, I knew it in my mind, but I didn't understand, I didn't grasp the sociological significance and the political significance and the cultural significance and the sentimental significance that it still has in America in 2020. And no doubt, this is an issue that will dominate the political and the social landscape of America for many years to come.
You said you hope there would be a female successor. A successor has not been named yet in New York. Could it still be a female? Because I would like that as well.
Actually, I am not free to reveal names, but the two names that Minister Ashkenazi, the foreign minister, mentioned to me as possible candidates to replace me, one of them is a woman, and the other is a man. So 50% chance. But yeah, I think unfortunately, I think since in the 72 years and many consul generals that served in New York, we had only one woman, a very able one, a very capable one, Coletta Vital. But yeah, I think it's about time we get a second female consul general.
We are nearing an election here. If the administration changes, do you think that will influence the relationship with Israel? And what would you like to say to Jewish communities right now?
Okay, I don't feel I can yet immerse myself in partisan politics on an election. But I will say this, we don't decide. It's an American decision, obviously. And it will be naive to claim that there is no difference regarding policies towards Israel between a probable second Trump administration and a first Biden administration. But Israel has a strategy that I hope it will continue to pursue under any circumstances. And that strategy is to be as close as possible, as intimate as possible, as friendly as possible with any administration the American people or the American Electoral College chooses. So if there is a Biden administration, a Biden-Harris administration, I am sure that Israel will do the utmost effort to have the most cordial, the most friendly, the most intimate relationship with such an administration. There will be issues that we will have to deal with. For instance, probably the first one will be a potential return of the US to the Iranian nuclear deal. No secret that we are opposed to that. And if there is a decision to return, we expect the Biden administration to negotiate toughly the return. But even if in that case there are differences of opinion, it's important to do it in a civil way, in a friendly way, as two allies should do it. I, for one, as you know, was very close to many Democrats. I think that for every Republican that I met in the area I cover, I met 5 or 6 Democrats. In my farewell Zoom events, there was a long list of Democrat leaders, members of Congress, and other leaders from around across the country that really I have their numbers on my speed dial, and we became personal and also political friends. One of the things that made me optimistic, because I am a staunch believer on the need of Israel to be bipartisan, is the primary elections in South Bronx. In South Bronx, the congressional district, I think it's 15, I'm not sure, is one of the poorest in New York State, if not the poorest. There are no Jews there virtually. Nevertheless, from the 6 candidates that aspired to replace Congressman Serrano, 5 of them were strong supporters of Israel, most of them progressives. At the top of the list, obviously the winner, Richie Thomas, which is also a personal friend. So that made me optimistic. You have here a district, a progressive district without Jewish constituency. Nevertheless, the candidates are staunchly pro-Israel, and the winner will be one of the most outspoken pro-Israel members of Congress in the next Congress, Richie Thomas.
Do you believe there needs to be a strong Jewish presence in both the Republican and Democratic Party?
I would like, of course, pro-Israel Jews to be active in both parties. Again, the last thing that will be is partisan American politics. Obviously, my interest is Israel. I must also say this, the steps made by the Trump administration during these last 4 years regarding Israel were amazing. It will be an ingratitude not to recognize it from my part, the moving of the embassy, the recognition of the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights, the withdrawal from the JCPOA, and the statement that the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal, and finally brokering the peace deal with the UAE. So I can't exaggerate the benefits that Israel had from this administration. That said, every American citizen has to do his entire calculation, what he wants for his country. I hope that Israeli friends will also put Israel's benefits or Israel's considerations in their equation.
So what's next for you? Can we expect to see you in politics again?
I am not sure. I haven't decided yet. paid a visit the other day to report to President Ruvi Rivlin, the President of the State of Israel, and his main advice is don't rush. Take your time, take a look at the landscape, and then make decisions. And when the president advises, I take his advice. We are not far from our high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. I hope we are not going into a second lockdown of Israel due to the coronavirus. So I assume that now I am mainly enjoying the country and meeting a lot of persons that I missed in all levels. I mentioned the president and others. And then I will make decisions. One thing I'm quite sure I will continue to be involved in public matters this way or the other.
Dani Dayan, former Ambassador and Consul General of Israel to New York, thanks so much for speaking.
Thank you so much, and I hope that I will be able to visit soon New York without the need to then quarantine 14 days in Israel when I'm back